There's a story most people have never heard, a story about one of the greatest scientific minds of the 20th century walking into a room full of brilliant, hard-working students and discovering something that shook him to his core. Not because the students were lazy, not because they were unintelligent, but because despite years of intense study, despite stacks of notebooks filled with perfect equations and flawless derivations, not a single one of them could answer a question a curious 12-year-old could have figured out on their own. What Richard Feynman uncovered in that room didn't just change how he thought about teaching physics, it changed how he thought about thinking itself. And the warning he issued afterward, quietly at first, then louder, is one of the most important things anyone pursuing any kind of knowledge has ever said. The terrifying part, almost nobody listened. The year was 1951. Feynman was 33 years old, already famous in physics circles for his work on quantum electrodynamics, already known for the almost reckless clarity of his mind. He thought differently from other physicists. Where most of his colleagues moved in the language of abstraction, Feynman wanted to feel physics. He wanted to see it, touch it, trace it back to something real. So when an invitation arrived from Rio de Janeiro, from Brazil's premier physics research institute, asking him to spend nearly a year teaching their most advanced students, Feynman said yes without much hesitation. He was curious. He wanted to see how physics was being taught on the other side of the world. He wondered if students shaped by a different culture, a different system, might see science from angles he hadn't considered. He packed his bags with genuine excitement. What he found when he arrived was not what he expected. The students weren't behind. If anything, they appeared to be ahead. They had studied the same texts used at MIT and Caltech. They had covered the same topics, worked through the same problem sets, sat through years of rigorous lectures. Their notebooks were immaculate. Their exam scores were extraordinary. By every measurable standard, these were exceptional physics students. But within the first few weeks, Feynman started to feel something was wrong. It started with questions. Feynman always opened his lectures with questions, not as a formality, not as a warm-up ritual. He asked questions the way a detective knocks on a door, because he genuinely wanted to know what was behind it. So he'd ask a student to explain not just what Snell's law said, but what was physically happening inside a material that caused light to slow down. He'd ask them to describe in plain language what Maxwell's equations were actually telling them about the universe. The students could recite the equations instantly, every symbol, every subscript perfectly positioned. But the moment Feynman asked why does this happen? What does this mean? What would change if this variable shifted? The room went quiet. It wasn't shyness. Feynman could feel the difference between a student who was nervous and a student who didn't know. This was the silence of people reaching for something that wasn't there. He started running small experiments in his lectures. He would teach a concept using one set of words, then ask about the same concept using slightly different language. The students couldn't make the connection. He would show them angular momentum using a circular path, and they'd master the circular case completely. Change the path to an ellipse, same formula, same underlying principle, new shape, and the answers fell apart. They weren't learning physics, they were learning templates. The clearest moment came during an exam. Feynman was proctoring for a colleague. The question was almost embarrassingly simple for anyone who genuinely understood electromagnetism. Double the current in a wire. What happens to the magnetic field it produces? Any student who had truly grasped the relationship between current and magnetism would answer in under 2 seconds. The field doubles. The relationship is linear. Done. Instead, Feynman watched the students frantically flip through their notebooks, hunting for the exact formula. One student found it, wrote it out, substituted the numbers, and arrived at the correct answer. Technically correct. Completely empty. He had not understood the question. He had executed a lookup. That was the moment Feynman truly understood what he was witnessing. These students had built elaborate, beautiful, towering structures of memorized knowledge. Every beam perfectly placed, every joint carefully fitted, and the whole thing was hollow. There was nobody home inside those structures. No actual understanding animated them. The knowledge sat there like furniture in a house where the lights are always off. On his final day in Rio, Feynman was invited to address the faculty and senior researchers of the Brazilian physics community. They expected a polished lecture. Reflections on quantum mechanics, perhaps? Some thoughts on the exciting directions the field was taking? What they got was something else entirely. Feynman stood up and told them, as directly and honestly as he knew how, that after 10 months with their students he had reached a conclusion he could not soften or dress up. Their students had learned nothing. Not in any meaningful sense of the word. They could pass exams. They could reproduce derivations with mechanical precision. But they could not think. They could not take a principle they had studied for years and apply it in a context they hadn't specifically rehearsed. They could not explain in their own words why the equations they'd memorized described reality. And then he said something that made the room even more uncomfortable. This wasn't only Brazil's problem. Feynman had a name for what he was describing. He borrowed it from something he'd heard about in the Pacific Islands after the Second World War. During the war, Allied military forces had established air bases on remote islands, and the local populations had watched in amazement as enormous metal machines descended from the sky, delivering unimaginable quantities of supplies, food, medicine, tools, clothing. Then the war ended. The soldiers left, the planes stopped coming, but some of the island communities wanted the planes to return. So they did what seemed logical. They had watched carefully. They knew the rituals. They cleared runways in the jungle. They built wooden replicas of aircraft. They fashioned headsets from coconut shells. They waved the torches and performed the ceremonies exactly as they had seen the soldiers do. The planes never came because they had mastered the form without ever grasping the function. They had reproduced the surface of something without understanding the mechanism beneath it. They were not stupid. They were doing exactly what they had been taught by observation. Imitate precisely and results will follow. It just happened to be completely wrong. Feynman looked at modern education and saw the same thing. Students performing the ceremonies of learning, attending lectures, filling notebooks, sitting exams, collecting grades, all the rituals perfectly executed. None of the actual cognitive transformation that the rituals were supposed to produce. Cargo cult education. All the form, none of the function. So what had gone so wrong? How does a system designed to produce understanding end up producing its exact opposite? Feynman saw it clearly. The first failure was in the books themselves, textbooks in physics, and not just in Brazil. He was quick to note were written to impress rather than illuminate. They front-loaded formalism. Mathematical rigor arrived before intuition had any foothold. Students encountered the Hamiltonian before they had any felt sense of what energy actually was, or why tracking it through a system told you something profound. The symbol came before the meaning, and the meaning never quite caught up. The second failure was in the exams. Exams are not neutral. They train students just as powerfully as lectures do, maybe more powerfully, because students know exactly what they'll be judged on. And when exams consistently reward accurate reproduction of memorized material over original thinking, students learn the lesson that actually matters to them. Memorize more, think less. Original reasoning is risky. You might make a mistake. Regurgitation is safe. The system taught them to be safe. The third failure was disconnection from the physical world. Physics is a description of reality. It should feel like reality. But the students in Brazil had never watched an actual experiment unfolding in front of them during a lecture. They had never been asked to make a prediction about what would happen and then watch the outcome. Physics had become a purely symbolic game, shapes on a page with no tactile connection to the world. Those shapes were describing. And the fourth failure, the deepest one, was the suppression of questioning. Students were expected to accept what they were told. The professor speaks, the textbook says, you record and reproduce. Questioning was not merely discouraged, it was structurally punished, because asking why slows down coverage, creates ambiguity, and interferes with the clean delivery of testable content. The system had no room for curiosity. When Feynman returned to Caltech, he carried this experience like a splinter. He couldn't stop noticing. He began looking at his own teaching differently. And eventually, when he was asked to redesign the foundational physics curriculum for Caltech undergraduates, he had a very clear idea of what he wanted to do. He started from the physics, not the mathematics. Before any formula appeared, students needed to have a felt intuition, a physical image in their minds of what was actually happening. Why does a spinning ice skater accelerate when she pulls in her arms? Not because angular momentum is conserved, that's the answer to a different question. Because she's pulling mass closer to an axis of rotation, and something in the nature of motion itself resists that change in a very specific way. Feel that first, then formalize it. He insisted on connections. Physics is not a list of separate topics. It is one coherent picture of how reality works. Feynman wanted students to see that the same mathematical structure showing up in mechanics also showed up in electromagnetism and in quantum theory. That was not a coincidence. That was the universe telling you something. He asked questions that couldn't be answered from memory. Why is the sky blue and not green? Why does metal feel colder than wood at the same temperature? What would happen to a compass needle if you placed it next to a beam of electrons moving in a straight line? These questions force students to build from principles, to reason from what they actually understood outward into new territory. The lectures he gave during those years were recorded and eventually published. They're still in use today, more than 60 years later, not because they're comprehensive, not because they cover the most material, but because students who read them come away feeling like they understand something, and more importantly, feeling like understanding is possible, that physics is not a locked vault of privileged formulas, but a living, breathing mode of engagement with the world. Here's the quiet devastation at the center of this story. The Brazilian students were not failures. They were victims of a system that had optimized for the wrong thing. They were hard workers trapped in a framework that turned hard work into performance. They deserved better. And in some sense, so do all of us who pass through systems just like theirs. Because the pattern Feynman identified in 1952 did not die with the Cold War. It is the dominant mode of education in most of the world right now. It has simply gotten more efficient. We have better technology for delivering information, more sophisticated tools for measuring whether students have absorbed it, and increasingly no infrastructure at all for nurturing genuine understanding. The graduates this system produces are competent inside familiar territory. They can execute established procedures. They can apply standard solutions to standard problems. But the moment reality stops cooperating, the moment a patient presents with symptoms that don't fit the textbook, or a bridge behaves in ways the standard calculations didn't predict, or a market moves in a direction no model anticipated, they have nothing to fall back on because they never built the foundational understanding that would let them reason their way through genuine novelty. What Feynman actually discovered in Brazil was not a flaw in Brazilian education. It was a flaw in how humans instinctively think about knowledge itself. We mistake familiarity for understanding. We mistake fluency with symbols for fluency with ideas. We mistake the ability to repeat something for the ability to use it. Real understanding has a very specific texture. You know you understand something when you can take it somewhere new, when you can explain it in a language the original source never used, when you can spot the errors in your own previous thinking, when you can feel in your gut why the answer has to be what it is before you formally derived it. That texture is rare. And it is rare because it takes something memorization doesn't. Genuine cognitive struggle, the willingness to sit with confusion without reaching for a formula to make the confusion stop, the courage to ask why when why isn't on the test. Feynman spent his whole career chasing that texture, modeling it, insisting on it, refusing to accept anything less from himself or the people around him. He was not always easy to work with. He was not always patient, but he was always relentlessly, genuinely thinking. That is his real legacy. Not the Nobel Prize, not the Feynman diagrams, not even the lectures. It's the insistence that understanding is not optional, that the world doesn't care how many formulas you have memorized, that at the moment of real consequence, when the plane has to fly, or the reactor has to hold, or the patient has to live, the only thing that matters is whether you actually know what you're doing. And knowing what you're doing starts with asking one simple, devastating question. Not how, why?